Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The annual Closing the Gap statement is a penetrating window into the character and wellbeing of our country. All else aside, we cannot be at peace with ourselves when the circumstances of so many First Australians situate them in a kind of parallel world, a world where everything is squeezed and tilted away from basic standards of social inclusion, healthcare, educational attainment, economic opportunity, cultural respect and freedom from discrimination. And so we can't be at peace with ourselves because, one way or the other, that is the case for too many Indigenous Australians. As others have noted, within the 7 key areas of marked disadvantage, only 2 of the Closing Gap targets are currently on track. That means we are not making progress to address the fact that child and infant mortality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids is twice as high than the rate in the broader population, or the fact that life expectancy is so different for Indigenous people, or the fact that employment participation remains widely divergent. It's interesting to note that the Closing the Gap summary refers to the unchanging gulf when it comes to employment participation as being stable. Stagnant would be a better word. If your mantra is that the best kind of support that government policy can deliver for people is a job, then you'd have to judge yourself pretty harshly on those numbers. Deputy Speaker, in 2018, the Indigenous child mortality rate was 141 per 100,000, yet for non-Indigenous kids it's only 67 per 100,000. It is a terrible gap. We can't accept it. The rate of Indigenous child mortality was falling until 2012, but has risen again since that time. The target to close the life expectancy gap by 2031 is not on track, and Indigenous Australians live on average 8 years fewer than non-Indigenous Australians. One thing we need to be clear about: the response to the lack of progress under the Closing the Gap framework cannot be to adjust the framework in order to let ourselves off the hook of achieving real change. That would be a cop-out and an abdication. Deputy Speaker, I want to specifically mention the issue of suicide, and before I do, I acknowledge the essential work of Lifeline. I make the point that anyone feeling at risk or having dark thoughts should speak to someone by calling 131 114. It's been very welcome to see the Prime Minister announce the creation of a permanent National Commissioner to investigate suicides among Defence Force personnel and veterans. But as we rightly apply ourselves to the awful and unacceptable rates of suicide among those who serve or have served in our Defence Forces, so we must acknowledge and be appalled by and galvanise ourselves in response to the scourge of suicide in Indigenous communities, particularly among Indigenous kids. Yeah. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are 2.8% of the Australian population. Do we reflect enough? Do we reflect enough on the fact that over the last 5 years, 25% of all children who died by suicide were Indigenous kids? The Kimberley in Western Australia has the nation's highest rate of youth suicide. I was with my predecessor, Melissa Park, when as the Parliamentary Secretary for Mental Health in 2013, she announced in Fremantle the first national strategy for Indigenous suicide prevention. It's an initiative that was largely discontinued under the Abbott government. Rob McPhee, Deputy CEO of the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Service and co-chair of the Commonwealth-funded Kimberley Aboriginal Suicide Prevention Working Group, has written about the kind of effort that is needed, and I quote, "Any sustainable response must go to the deeper underlying historical causes of hopelessness and despair, which contributes to suicide. This isn't just a problem among children. The suicide rate peaks in those aged between 25 and 34. These deeper causes include intergenerational trauma, poverty, racism, social exclusion, substandard housing and economic marginalisation of our communities that are the legacies of colonisation." Deputy Speaker, there's a clear element in what Mr McPhee says that goes to the unresolved question and the unrequited promise of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. That came from a process that was based on listening to Indigenous Australians. Yet what was clearly communicated through that painstaking work: 1, the decision for proper recognition, the need for truth-telling and agreement-making process in the form of a Makarrata Commission, and a First Nations voice to Parliament. These simple, sensible, vital steps forward have so far been ignored. It's true that just by speaking in this place alone, we will not bring change. That's one of the reasons it's so vital that we work harder to listen to what Indigenous people are saying.